thank you all for coming. Hope you had a great lunch. Welcome to the lecture concert series, Iconic Monsters of Halloween. We always try to do a Halloween lecture before actual Halloween or the day of Halloween, and we rotate between some of our professors. So this year, we're very excited to have Dr. Brent Bristow with us. He is co-chair with me. My name is Andrea Cole of Lecture Concert Series. So I'm just going to turn it over to Dr. Bristow. Make sure that you silence your phones. We're going to dim the lights a little bit, maybe, and then enjoy, because this is going to be fun. Thank you.
All right, well, good afternoon, and thanks for being here. So I didn't realize that they were going to be handing out Bibles outside of my Halloween lecture, so I guess I'm officially a bad influence, finally. So anyway, I love Halloween. It's a lot of fun. Unfortunately, because of my involvement with marching band, first as a student and a college student and then as a teacher, I didn't really get to participate in it for many years. And so now I've really kind of making up for lost time for the last few years. But I have a friend who is a huge Christmas fan. Like, he's one of those guys that's probably was already listening to Christmas carols back in May. And he sent me a message and said, "So are you going to do a Christmas lecture next?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, I can do that." That's no problem. So anyway, we're going to start in here. So what we're talking about is we're going to talk about some of the iconic characters that we associate with Halloween. And we're going to start with this. Some of you guys are probably familiar with the Jib Jab app or software. And this was one that I found several years ago. It's got Rachel Ray's face stuck in it. But even so, we immediately recognize the characters. Now, this is the only audience participation within the lecture. So I'm going to ask you all to say them with me. So let's name them as we go along. Mummy. Dracula. Witch. Frankenstein. Wolfman. Okay. So these characters have become so iconic that even when we see them in a very simplistic form like this, we immediately know who they are, right? So the question is, where did these specific images come from? How did they become the iconic images that we think of today? And what has been their effect on modern culture, okay? So starting out with this, a lot of these characters such as mummies and vampires, werewolves, those sort of things, all started with ancient superstitions that have been around for centuries. Just a few years ago, they found this grave over somewhere in Western Europe that had a stake stuck through its heart. So we know there's got to be an interesting story there. And then, of course, even in America and a good bit of Europe, there have been witch hunts. My wife and I recently went to Salem. Very interesting things that we sort of learned there about the witch hunts. Of course, in America, they didn't burn the witches, they hung them, but still very horrific as a result of that. But the idea of these characters, of these supernatural beings, have been around in superstitions for centuries. And so by the time that we get into the 1800s, they're starting to find their way into entertainment and literature in particular. In 1818, a book called Frankenstein is published by Mary Shelley. And then in the 1890s, we also get Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, these are very successful novels, but when you read them, the characterizations that the authors give of these characters look nothing like what we think of as the iconic images that are associated with the characters. So when you look at how the author described them, they don't look anything like what we just saw a moment ago, okay? So now we're going to go into the 20th century and we're going to talk about the early days of film. Now, what I'm going to tell for some of you college students, this is probably going to sound terrifying to you, but let's go back to the days when the only way that you could see movies was to actually go to a movie theater. There was no such thing as home video. There was no television even at this point, and certainly no such thing as internet or streaming. But the good thing is that you could go see a movie without somebody's cell phone going off, because cell phones wouldn't exist for almost another century. Okay, so one of the earliest films, one of the earliest horror films ever made, a very short film, it's only about 10 minutes long, is an adaptation of Frankenstein, that was produced by Thomas Edison. As you can see from the picture, the character looks nothing like our iconic image. But things start to take a real turn in Germany with expressionistic films. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, starring Conrad Veidt. This was the first horror film to depict someone being attacked in their bed in their sleep, which had never been seen in a movie before. Of course, movies have only been around for about 10 years at that point. But people found that very terrifying. Then you have the Golem, based upon the Jewish legend of the Golem. This is actually, there were sequels, prequels, the whole bit. This was the first real horror franchise that came out. And then one of the most interesting ones is Nosferatu, which was an unauthorized version of Dracula that F.W. Murnau, a German director, did. He just changed all the names. Instead of Count Dracula, it was Count Orlok, so forth and so on, thinking he was going to sneak it by without getting the rights. But Stoker's widow realized what was going on. They sued. All copies of this were ordered to be destroyed. Fortunately, a few survived, so we can still watch it today. And although this is not really our iconic image, the image of Orlok in Nosferatu is really iconic in itself and has its own fans, so it's a very interesting film. Now in America, we're going over to Universal Studios. Carl Laemmle Jr., who was running the studio at that time, realized that there was a market for this and ended up producing several monster movies, including The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which isn't quite a traditional horror film, but Quasimodo, portrayed by Lon Chaney, was considered to be a very monstrous image. Chaney was actually known as the Man of a Thousand Faces. He did all of his own makeup work. He didn't use a special effects artist. He did it all himself. A few years later, he did probably one of his most iconic roles when he did Eric from The Phantom of the Opera, one of the most striking versions of this film, and considered to be one of the really early American classic horror films. Also around this time is the movie The Man Who Laughs, again with Conrad Veidt coming to America to play Gwyn Plaine. This is the character that the Joker from the Batman comic books was based upon. Okay, I'm sure you can tell that from the photo. So by the time that we get to 1930, we're moving away from silent films, and they actually have sound. Okay, so you can actually hear the dialogue for the first time instead of having to read the cards. And Universal, knowing that these horror films were going to be hugely successful, they licensed the rights to make a big budget version of Dracula. Well, that was the plan, but unfortunately in 1931 they were right in the middle of the Great Depression, which meant that they really didn't have a lot of money to do a big budget version, so the budget kept shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. Todd Browning, who was a well-known director at the time, he had done a number of silent films. He was picked to do this. He probably, in horror circles, he was probably most well-known at this time for producing the movie London After Midnight, starring Lon Chaney. Unfortunately, that's a lost film. It doesn't exist anymore. If someone could find a copy of it in their closet somewhere, they would be a very rich person. So, go look through your attics. Maybe one exists somewhere. So he takes over as being the director of this film, and the only person that he wanted to play Dracula was his friend Lon Chaney, who he'd worked with on numerous films. The only problem was that Chaney was suffering from cancer, and he actually died before the production of Dracula could begin. So now they needed to find the Dracula. So enter Hungarian actor Bela Lugosi, who had only been in America for a few years. He had done a few bit roles in some silent films and things, but really his biggest claim to fame at this point was that he had portrayed Dracula in a Broadway production, theatrical production, and to great acclaim. And so he started really campaigning for the role. And really he got the role because he agreed to do it for such a low amount. He was only paid $500 a week to do the film for a starring role in a Universal film that was extremely low. So he ended up only making $3,500 for the entire thing. Okay? But the gamble paid off because it did make him a star at this point. So when we look at Lugosi and his portrayal, we see the slick back hair, the tuxedo, the medallion, the black cape, all of the things that we associate with Dracula all comes from this. And really it's a budget saving thing, right? It's really easy. Let's make a vampire, put him in a tuxedo instead of designing a new suit, right? So it was a very easy thing to do. Now, one of the really iconic things of this is the accent. This is how my day has been going. Sorry about that. So anyway, one of the really iconic things with Lugosi's portrayal was the accent, the thick Hungarian accent, which was his actual accent. He wasn't putting on a fake accent. He wasn't acting. That's how he actually talked, which really kind of held him back in some later roles because he would be someone like Dr. Thomas Brown, but he would have this thick Hungarian accent. It was kind of like the precursor to Arnold Schwarzenegger, really. So with Dracula, though, as he's Transylvanian, this really worked to portray the character. And this has been imitated a million times, including in comedy films such as George Hamilton in Love at First Bite, made back in the 70s. More recently, the TV show Supernatural, when they brought in the character pretending to be Dracula. And then, of course, since we are in the math and science building, we also have to mention this guy. Okay, who also is imitating the Lugosi accent. Okay, this becomes a very important part of this. Now, after the success of Dracula, Universal is very eager to cash in on making another horror film. So they very quickly buy the rights to do Frankenstein. And for this film, they get James Whale to be the director. But Whale didn't want to do horror films. He wanted to do the big Oscar-winning films of the day. Ironically, now that we're in 2023, we know that nobody really remembers what won the Oscar in 1931, but we do remember Frankenstein. It has had a legacy that's held on that we still know. In order to create the makeup for Frankenstein, Jack Pierce, who was a makeup artist working for Universal, he was sort of the first real rock star of special effects makeup. He was picked to do all of the makeup for the character. Now, Lugosi was asked to play the role of the monster, and initially he agreed, and there was even some posters and some press put out about Lugosi coming back and playing the monster in Frankenstein, until he got the script and realized he had no lines, he had no speaking parts, in which case he backed out and said, forget it, I'm not doing it. So Whale was actually in like the cafeteria area at Universal Studios, and he saw this guy by the name of William Henry Pratt, who had been a bit actor. He was in his 40s, never had a starring role in his life, and was just in the cafeteria, and Whale said, he's got a look that I think would be perfect. So he approached him and asked if he wanted to do this role. And he said, yes, sure. Now, if you're not familiar with the name William Henry Pratt, that's probably because he went by the stage name Boris Karloff, which is why we sort of associate the name Boris as being associated with horror films. So Karloff, along with Whale and Jack Pierce, end up creating this look. And when we look at Karloff in the role of Frankenstein, here we see all of the iconic images. The flat head with the little clamps on it, all of the scars. They put weights on his eyes to kind of give him the sort of droopy look. He had dental bridges on the side. He took those out so his cheeks would be a little more sunken in. They put him in raised boots to make him look taller than he was, put him in an overly small jacket so that it only comes up to here. Okay? So these are all the things we think of. And of course, probably one of the most famous things there are the electrodes in his neck. Now, some people think these are bolts holding his neck on, but it's not. They were the electrodes that were used to get the electricity into the body. Okay? Now, they played up on the fact that Karloff was an unknown actor. Early on, they just billed him as question mark. It was sort of a mystery. Who was the monster? Was it the real monster? We didn't know. Eventually, that's going to change for Karloff, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, one of the things that we really get from this film as well, a couple of things, the idea of having a hunchback assistant. Okay? That's become a very iconic part of the Dracula mythology. Plus this idea of using all this electrical equipment and the creature being brought to life during a stormy night and everything. Most of that comes from the film. And all of this equipment actually still exists today and has been used in hundreds of movies over the years. In the next sequel to this, we get another iconic character with the Bride of Frankenstein, played by Ilsa Lanchester. Lanchester has actually had red auburn hair, and that's her natural hair. So if you see a Bride of Frankenstein with black hair, that's incorrect. It should be red, okay? Except for the white streaks on the side. What's really interesting about the Bride is that she has become such an iconic part of what we think of with Halloween and being such an important character. She only appears in 5 minutes of the film. That's it. In the next film, Lugosi finally shows up as Igor. So finally we get to see Igor, the assistant. And this was a bit part that Lugosi really just tore into, and he ends up stealing the show. This really becomes a starring role for him, even though he didn't get top billing. And this becomes such an iconic thing that he ends up getting to play Igor in a couple more films, and really brings that character to life from this point on. Every time you have a mad scientist with an assistant, their name is typically Igor. Comes from this, okay? So as we move forward, after the success of these films, a few years later, a couple of sequels, they want to have another monster. And it hasn't been too many years since the expedition that found the tomb of King Tut. And along with that, there were all of these rumors of a curse. Anyone who disturbed the tomb was going to die a horrible death. And this was a huge thing. It was in the news. And it became this thing where, like, if anyone was involved in the expedition and their sisters, boyfriends, brothers, college roommates, third cousin died, it had to be the curse. It was like such a bizarre thing that they were trying to associate to this. But it was in the popular culture at the time, so it was only natural that they were going to make a horror film based upon the mummy. But this time, instead of billing him as question mark, Karloff has now become so famous, they just bill him as Karloff the Uncanny. Okay, and within 4 years, he's become a household name. And we see, again, Jack Pierce doing the makeup. There are two makeups that we get. One is when they find him in the tomb, wrapped in the bandages. And then after he walks off, comes to life and walks off, he comes back years later calling himself Ardith Bay and still has all these wrinkles and things in his face, but looks basically like a human at this point. All of these effects were done by Jack Pierce. So we really only get to see him in the bandages really in the first few minutes of the film. But in the subsequent sequels that come out, we start seeing this image. Okay, in fact, they usually even put like one of his arms is still like in the bandages where he can't even get free, and he's sort of shambling around the desert. In one sequel, they even bring him to Boston, and he's under the control of someone who's, you know, making him run around and murder people. But this is where we get the idea of the mummy still in the bandages, you know, wandering around the countryside murdering people. Okay, they all come from the sequels that happened after the original Mummy. So we're moving from the Mummy and Universal Films now. We're moving on to The Wizard of Oz and The Wicked Witch of the West. Now I know you're thinking that The Wizard of Oz is not really a horror film. And yes, that is true. However, for a lot of people, when they first saw this film, they were usually 5, 6 years old, something like that. And seeing the Wicked Witch suddenly appear and being so mean to Dorothy and trying to do all these horrible things was really terrifying to kids of that age. And so this was the first sort of exposure that they had to the witch for several generations, and we'll talk about that later. Portrayed by Margaret Hamilton, who had been a well-known actress at the time. She actually had even been a school teacher for a while. But they hired her to play the role of the witch. Now what's interesting is in the novels, the witch is described more like this, wearing these outfits. She's supposed to be this very short woman. She's carrying around an umbrella. The hat, now this is a really interesting thing. Somewhere along the way, some artist decided that a wizard was going to wear a conical hat with different designs on it with no brim, while a witch was going to wear one with a brim. I don't know why, but that suddenly became a thing that they were portrayed as. The big ruffled on the neck, the pigtails and things like this. So this is how she was described in the book. But when they brought her to life in the film, they gave her this greenish skin. She's carrying a broom, dressed in all black. Instead of being this very short woman, she's very tall and thin. They depict her with these long claw-like fingers. And of course, one of the other things in the outfit that we associate that we saw in all of the little images we saw at the beginning is the striped leggings that she's always wearing for some reason underneath the entire black. So I guess there's, I don't know if they were trying to depict that maybe there was some white, a little bit of good in her, I don't know. But, or if it was just a wardrobe choice, but whatever it was, this is part of the role. Now, for years, children were still terrified of Margaret Hamilton when they would meet her because of this. And she really didn't like this because she loved children and it always broke her heart. She actually ended up appearing on Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers, trying to sort of improve the image, but she did get to do one of the coolest things in 1976 when she got to introduce television audiences to the rock band Kiss. So a little bit of vindication there. So one of the, I believe that's the first television appearance of Kiss being introduced by the Wicked Witch. sort of an awesome thing there. Coming back to Universal, we're going to start talking about the idea of werewolves. So the idea of a man turning into a wolf. Again, this was one of those ancient superstitions, been around for a long time. But of course, this was a man who was actually turning into an actual wolf. Now, of course, Hollywood didn't have CGI back in those days, and there was really no way to do that, so they ended up having to figure out a way to make this work. So the first attempt at this is a movie called Werewolf of London, starring Henry Hull. Very interesting makeup, not quite the iconic makeup that we think of. So this is a very interesting movie, and Universal's first attempt at making a werewolf film. Unfortunately, it was not a huge success. This came out 1 year after The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, starring Frederick March. The makeup is somewhat similar to March's a little bit, but when the character turns into a werewolf, he does things like puts on a hat and a scarf to disguise himself, and he's sneaking around and very unwolf-like. And so people sort of looked at this and said, this is just a Jekyll and Hyde ripoff, so we're not really interested in this. So it didn't really take off and become a huge success. So it's going to be another 7 years or so before we finally get The Wolfman, starring Lon Chaney Jr. Now, Lon Chaney Jr., obviously the son of Lon Chaney that we talk about, becomes a horror icon. He ends up playing not only the Wolfman, but he also plays Frankenstein's monster in one film. He ends up also playing the son of Dracula in yet another film, and became very much a very iconic part of these horror films. The Wolfman introduces a lot of things to this. The idea of wolfsbane, the idea that the person who was bitten is going to have a pentagram somewhere on their body, the idea that silver is the only thing that would kill a werewolf. All of those things really come out of this film. Again, working with Jack Pierce, as we see here. This is the iconic image that we think of the Wolfman, of being a man who actually has hair all over his face, a sort of turned up dog-like nose, the canine sticking up, and roaming around in the woods in Eastern Europe somewhere, okay? So this is our fifth and final of the iconic monsters. Now, also the last truly successful film that was happening of these, because there ends up being a regime change in Universal, so they end up getting new leadership. As a result, the budgets of these films keep shrinking. They're no longer interested in making them until finally they end up being shown in comedy films along with Abbott and Costello. Now, these films were actually interesting, and one thing that they did try to do was they tried to always treat the monsters with respect. The comedy came from Abbott and Costello, not from the monsters. But still, for people who love these characters, that wasn't really what they wanted to see. They wanted to see actual horror films. But by the time we get to 1950, a lot of this stuff has fallen out of fashion. And actually, it's hard to believe, but these films had really become almost forgotten at this point, because there was a much greater danger that people were sort of facing and dealing with on a daily basis, that they weren't really too concerned about a Transylvanian vampire or a monster created in some castle somewhere, because it had only been a few years since the invention of the atomic bomb. And now people were very concerned with the fact that the Russians might drop the nuclear weapons on us at any time, at the beginning of the Cold War. So this was a very real threat that people were dealing with. And so the idea of Gothic horror falls out of popularity. And now we start getting movies that are more horror, science fiction, a lot of it having to do with nuclear energy and things. Universal does introduce its last great monster with The Creature from the Black Lagoon, but then we also start getting a lot of movies starring giant insects and things like that, and this all sort of culminates with, of course, with the Japanese film Godzilla. Okay. So by the time that you get to this point, the classic monsters are really just kind of forgotten about. No one is really interested in them. So how did they start becoming an iconic part of our culture? Well, that happens because of television. So the television becomes commercially available around 1948. By the time that you get to the mid-50s, more people have them in their home. Not everyone, but more people have them in their home. Keep in mind, there's still no such thing as home video at this point. You just had to watch whatever was on TV, and probably only had about 3 channels, and that was about it, right? But in 1957, a very important event happens, the first screening of The Wizard of Oz on CBS. And CBS will show The Wizard of Oz once a year up through the 1990s. So for almost 40 years, once a year, this film is seen on television. And so every year, there's a new generation of children seeing this, being terrified by the Wicked Witch of the West, right? So she becomes a very important part of our culture. Now, the other thing happens 1 year later in 1958. So keep in mind that these television stations, you know, they've got to fill up so many hours of the day with programming. And because television was new, they'd never heard of a rerun. They didn't know what that was, right? So there wasn't Gilligan's Island and Brady Bunch to show or things like that. Couldn't watch those kind of things because they didn't exist yet, right? So they were always looking for things to show, particularly late at night after the evening news went off, they still had to show something. So Universal takes several of these films plus a bunch more, and they create a package called Shock Theater, which included 52 of these films, and they would sell them, or sell the rights to individual stations that they could show one night a week, usually Friday or Saturday night, late night, your creature feature kind of thing. And this gave them an entire year's worth of broadcasting for a Friday or Saturday night, okay? And then a year later, they introduced Son of Shock, which added another 28 films. Now, what's interesting here is that means that these films were on a rotation. There was no such thing as home video, remember? So if your favorite film was The Bride of Frankenstein, that meant you had to wait an entire year to see it again. And as a result of that, these films started building up kind of a mystique, because people were dying to see these films that they only got to see like once a year, so it kind of became an event. Now the idea was that these were going to be shown late at night. These weren't considered appropriate for prime time like The Wizard of Oz was. These were considered to be late night shows for when the kids had already went to bed. But it wasn't the parents who was watching them, it was the kids. And this gives birth to what we call the monster kid generation. These were kids who grew up in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, watching all these old horror movies and being obsessed with them, wanting to know everything about them. Many of them ended up, as we'll talk about later, getting into the industry themselves. Okay? And so this becomes almost kind of an obsession for a lot of these kids, that they're really into these films. The only problem is that parents were afraid of their kids watching these things. So what the networks come up with, or the television stations, they weren't really networks, but what they come up with is the idea of having a horror host, okay? Starting out with Vampira, she was the first one. Interestingly, the only actress in a regional television show to win a national Emmy. So very interesting bit of history there with her. And then Zachary the Cool Ghoul. And what they would do is they would introduce the movies dressed as these sort of spooky characters, but they would make jokes and do little comedy bits. And that sort of lightened up the tension and made it okay for kids to watch these things. It sort of lightened up the mood and made it a little bit more acceptable. Horror hosts are still around today, probably the most famous of which is Elvira. Dr. Gangrene, who's around Louisville, Penny Dreadful, and Wolfman Max. So we still have these kind of things. Swinguli is getting really popular, doing stuff on MeTV. And so this idea of the horror host, this tradition is still around today. And this sort of made it okay for the kids to be able to watch this, okay? So now we have the monster kid generation. We have a generation who's really into these films, but they really need a voice. And they find their voice in a guy named Forrest J. Ackerman. Don't you just love that name, right? Who wouldn't love to have the name Forrest J. Ackerman? It sounds like you're a very powerful businessman in the 1950s. But actually he wasn't. What he really was he was a film historian, as it tells you. He actually collected props from movies and things like that, from sci-fi movies, horror movies. They called it a mansion. It wasn't really a mansion. It was just a really big house, but it was a museum. He would actually let people come in and see all of these things that he had collected. He actually appeared in a few movies himself. But he was so into this, and one of the things that he really kind of noticed was that, let's be honest, most of the monster kid generation were boys. There wasn't a lot of the girls who were really into Dracula and things like that. So it was mostly the boys. And what he noticed is that if you went to the magazine stand at like a grocery store or something like that, for a young boy, you could find things, magazines on camping and hunting and football and things like that, all the stuff that was at the time socially acceptable, because keep in mind, being a monster kid was not popular. You were not one of the cool kids, you were one of the nerds, And I say that as one of them, so don't take it as an insult. But this was something that he noticed, that if you were really into this stuff, there was nothing there for you. So he started publishing a magazine called Famous Monsters of Filmland, with some brilliant art for the covers. There you see a couple of our monsters that have graced the cover of Famous Monsters of Filmland. And so because these kids were so into these movies, they would do these articles about these movies that were 30 years old at the time, right? And kids would get these magazines and they would go over them. So these monster kids grew up knowing who Jack Pierce was, who James Whale was, you know, who played Frankenstein in any particular movie. Was it Karloff? Was it Chaney? Who was it, right? So we get all of these things happening here, and they become very connected to these films through reading these articles, because they couldn't just go and stream them over and over like we can today. Now, one of the really interesting things here is that Ackerman, known as Uncle Forey to the kids, also included a mail page. He would let the kids write in, get a picture, show where they're from, write about what movies they liked and everything. And this was really interesting because what would happen would be, as I said, you know, usually if you were a monster kid in your school, you probably were the only one, maybe one other kid. But what they would do is they would say, hey, this kid in the next town over wrote a letter to Famous Monsters. I'm going to see if I can track them down. And they ended up, lifelong friendships started out of the mail page of Famous Monsters of Filmland. And this is like social media, you know, 30 years before anybody ever heard of the internet, is really what's kind of happening here. So it's really, I mean, this is a prototype for Facebook right here. This is essentially what's happening. And it all starts within the Famous Monsters of Filmland. So let's talk about what some of the effects of this are. In the 1960s, this becomes so popular that we start seeing the monsters come back. In particular, the Munsters, so we get comedy versions. Saturday morning, you can watch the Groovy Ghoulies, if you're into the Saturday morning cartoons. Hammer Horror, the movie studio in London, Hammer Studios, they end up buying the rights to make all these films, so now we have new versions of Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, Witches, and Werewolves, now portrayed by such classic actors as Oliver Reed, Peter Cushing, and of course Christopher Lee. So they start making these new modern in-color versions with way more blood and gore. And so these start becoming the new generation of Gothic horror that's happening, and these are still considered to be classic films today. Then we start getting things like The Addams Family, when we just had a new Wednesday series came about last year, so they were still feeling the effects of that. Boris Karloff comes back, and by this time Boris Karloff is still, in the 1960s, a household name. He's still well known, still a working actor. He's hosting a television anthology series called Thriller. One of the really interesting things of this was that he also lends his voice. There's this writer guy who's writing these children's books nobody's ever heard of. His name is Dr. Seuss. And they're trying to make a cartoon of one of his books. Well, how are we going to get people to watch this? Let's get Boris Karloff to do it. So he ends up narrating How the Grinch Stole Christmas. It's hard to believe this now, but in the 1960s when this first aired, more people watched it because of Karloff than they did Dr. Seuss, because nobody ever heard of Dr. Seuss. So you can thank Karloff for that. Then we start getting Dark Shadows. Daily soap opera, daytime soap opera. Started out as just a standard show of this rich family called the Collins, who lived in this small town in Maine. All these little secrets, you know, maybe they murdered somebody, you don't know. Ratings were really terrible until they finally introduced the character of Barnabas Collins, who was a 200-year-old vampire who becomes released. And this show becomes an overnight success. And it becomes so popular that a year later we end up getting Scooby-Doo. Now you may be thinking to yourself, well, what's the connection there? Well, the popularity of this made them think that they wanted to do some kind of like horror cartoon for kids. But if you don't believe there's a connection, here's the opening shot of every episode of Dark Shadows. Here's the opening shot of season 1 of Scooby-Doo. Okay, so they were definitely trying to play upon the popularity of Dark Shadows. Over the course of 1,225 episodes, Dark Shadows introduces more vampires, werewolves, witches, a Frankenstein monster, a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. They do time travel, they do parallel universes, everything, all on the budget of a 1960s soap opera. So it's really kind of interesting. But in many ways, this is kind of really the last big hurrah for Gothic horror, because during this time period is when we start getting things like Charles Manson appearing. If you're not familiar with Charles Manson was in Los Angeles believe it or not, in the 1960s in Los Angeles was still a time that people used to not bother locking their doors at night. Hard to believe that in a city like Los Angeles, but it's true. Charles Manson was actually, whatever else you may know about him, he was actually a songwriter. The Beach Boys actually recorded one of his songs. And he was working with this producer who he thought was going to help him make really big, and he realized that Manson was crazy. And Manson was running this ranch where all these runaway kids were, and he basically formed a cult. He brainwashed all of them and kind of formed a cult. And so basically that producer realized that Manson was nuts and just dropped him. So Manson sent some of his followers into the house. The producer didn't even live there anymore, but he went into the house and ended up killing everyone in the house, including Sharon Tate, who was an actress who was pregnant at the time, and had his followers write lots of things, including Beatles lyrics in blood on the wall, the victim's blood on the wall. This was shocking. 2 nights later, they went into another just random person's house that they had no connection to whatsoever and did the same thing. So again, with this kind of shocking thing happening so close to home, Gothic horror, once again, sort of seems a little like not as scary as what was going on. And this is kind of really the birth with Manson and a few other things, sort of the birth of the modern sort of slasher film, rather than supernatural creatures, just some guy in a hockey mask chasing you with a chainsaw or whatever. But the effects that we get from the monster kids is definitely still felt today. Let's talk about some of those. First of all, this is the beginning of fandom. So some of the first fan-made magazines and fan fiction comes from the people who were really into monsters. Okay, they were producing these things. They were trying to connect with each other in a way. Years before Star Trek fans did it, horror comics were more popular in the 60s than superhero comic books. It's really not going to be until you get to the late 60s with the Batman TV show that superheroes start becoming popular again. Everyone was into horror comics in the 60s. So this was a very different time. Merchandising, this was sort of the beginning of merchandising of movies and things, which is interesting because these movies were 20, 30 years old at the time. But you could still buy patches to iron on your t-shirt, action figures, calendars, model kits to glue together and paint, glasses, anything you wanted you could get with the monsters. Now, the other thing, I've mentioned this several times, is sequels. People today are always talking about, man, all Hollywood ever does anymore is produce sequels. Yeah, that's a new thing. And I didn't even include all of them. And also, with people were talking about how with Marvel, with the Avengers, they created this shared universe. Well, they did that back in the 40s. Okay? They brought all of the monsters together, first with Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, and then we even get all of these together. And they even include the Hunchback and the Mad Doctor and all of that. So they bring all of them together in these couple of films. So this was all happening years before Marvel had the idea to do it. So this is a little dated, but you get the idea. Prior to this, for Halloween, people just covered their face with whatever they had, which is 20 times more terrifying than most of what we have today, right? So this is the beginning of the idea of costumes and cosplay. Now, there were Superman costumes, and there were Mickey Mouse costumes and things like that. But that wasn't really what you were into. Okay, you could go and you could buy for a couple of bucks these sort of polyester costumes with a little mask with a little rubber band on the back of it. If you really wanted to spend some money, you could do these really nice rubber masks here. These were great. I always wanted one of these. My mom would never let me buy one. She would always say, you won't be able to breathe with that thing on. I think it was really because it was more expensive and she just didn't want to buy it. But I always wanted one of those as a kid. And then Famous Monsters even did some issues telling you how to do your own monster makeup if you were interested in doing that. So as I said, you could be Superman if you wanted to. You could do that. But everybody wanted to be, everybody wanted to be the monsters. Everybody wanted to be Frankenstein or a witch or Dracula or whatever. These were the popular characters of the time and still are in a lot of ways today. Today, the idea of cosplay, costuming, I mean, have you been at Spirit Halloween recently? This is a multi-million-dollar business, okay, that people are really into this stuff. And this all really starts with the monsters. That's kind of really the beginning of this, and then it's sort of branched on from there. Also, along with this, back in the 1960s, at the height of the popularity of the monster kid generation, the community group, the JCs, were looking for a way to make money. They rented out an old grocery store, put in different rooms put on rubber masks and got chainsaws and decided to charge people to come in and get scared. This became so successful that other groups started doing this. Again, today, this is a multi-million, if not a multi-billion-dollar business that's still around today. And we even went, as I mentioned to you, we went to Salem over the summer. They run these year-round. They're not just around Halloween. You go there, you can go to one anytime, all day, every day. Modern horror. Now, I know these are a little dated, but many of these monster kids who grew up being obsessed with this stuff went on to become writers. I mean, do you think Stephen King just suddenly got the idea for it out of the blue, having never watched a horror movie in his life? You know, this is sort of where a lot of these kids went. They became makeup artists. They became writers. They got involved with this, and who do you think is producing the stuff that's being made today, right? A lot of this is coming from these people who grew up loving these films and being obsessed with them. So we really owe a lot to these monsters and with what they're doing, and I think that it's interesting because there are so many of my students who recognize these characters immediately, but they've never seen the films. So I really do recommend, as you're going to celebrate Halloween, and you have all weekend to do it, most of these films are actually now on Amazon, and you can stream them. So I recommend that you maybe give some of them a shot. Most of them are pretty short, about an hour and 15 minutes long. Son of Frankenstein's maybe a little bit longer. But these are very interesting films and still hold up today, so you should definitely check them out. So that pretty much is the end of the lecture, but if anyone has some questions, I will do my best to answer.
I had one beginning, not thought.
Sure.
Sounds like, oh, what
It's a lot of pressure.
So what's your absolute favorite horror film?
You know, I don't know if I can pick an absolute favorite. I would definitely say that Dracula is probably my favorite character. I've been a huge fan of Dracula films of all different kinds for years. I would have a hard time picking between Lugosi and Lee on which one is my favorite one, but those are definitely my two favorites for sure.
What about 1930s Dracula versus Nosferatu?
Well, they're very different films. They're very, very, very different films. So it's hard to, I don't know that I've ever really made that connection. They're very different films in a lot of ways because there's so much more, boy, this could turn into a very lengthy discussion. But I think with both films, they create an atmosphere, but they're very different. Of course, filmmaking was very different, and so you get a lot of stuff with Nosferatu. One of the interesting things about Nosferatu, by the way, I'll mention, is that it was the first time, it wasn't in any of the legends that a vampire would die in sunlight. That comes from Nosferatu. That's where that's how he dies. Spoiler alert from a movie that's 110 years old. But that's how he ends up dying at the end. And so that was the first time that's added to the legend, is through that. But it's interesting because filmmaking was so different back then, and they had to have the exposure to light, that there are these scenes that are supposed to be taking place at night that they're obviously doing during the daylight. That kind of takes a little bit away from it, I think. But definitely the makeup is much more striking for sure. Probably if I had to pick one or the other, I would probably go with the 31. Yes?
So this is a while back, when you were talking about how the Bride of Frankenstein's hair is actually like auburn red.
Mm-hmm.
Why did they change it? Why did they keep it black?
They did. It's a black and white film.
Well, I mean, there are some like
Right,
iterations
right,
that
right.
are black hair.
Yeah, well, I think that a lot of people just see the black and white film and they just automatically assume it's black because it looks black in the black and white film, but that's not what her natural hair color actually was.
So there are iterations where it actually is red.
Sometimes, yeah.
Okay.
So, and part of it might have to do with licensing too. Like, for instance, one of the things with that you'll see a lot of times when you see Frankenstein, he won't look exactly like Karloff, and that's the reason for that is that Universal owns the makeup and the look of Frankenstein, but they don't own Karloff's image. So sometimes they'll do paintings and stuff with a more sort of generic looking Frankenstein that doesn't really look like Karloff, and that's the reason why. Yes?
Was Vlad the Impaler the idea from Dracula? Is that where that comes from?
He was one of the inspirations that Stoker looked at. Yeah, there were several inspirations that he looked at when he was doing research for the book, and that was definitely one of them. But he certainly wasn't the only one.
Oh, okay.
But he's sort of the primary one that looked at. Did you have a question?
I did. When did people start romanticizing these monsters?
Romanticizing about the
Yes,
monsters?
because now there's all this werewolf novels about werewolf love, and there's Dracula love, there's vampire love.
Well, I think that I would say Dark Shadows actually is where it begins. So the idea, so this is interesting. Barnabas was only supposed to be on the show for like 13 weeks, and then they were going to find he was a vampire and kill him. But he becomes so popular, and he starts getting all these letters, and they're from women who are very much in love with the character of Barnabas. And so ABC says, you can't kill Barnabas. And so he becomes the star of the show. So they had to he had to go through this sort of character arc transformation to quit being the evil bad guy to now being the hero of the show. And I think that came because there were a lot of people who, because the whole idea of Barnabas, he brings in this character, this was never in the novel of Dracula, never in any of the movies, until the made-for-TV version in the 70s that was made by the same guy that made Dark Shadows. He introduced the idea of Barnabas. Barnabas was he had lost a woman he loved, and he finds this girl in the modern era that he believes is her because she looks exactly like her and everything. And so this becomes sort of the premise of Barnabas, and then that gets brought in to the Dracula myth, and then in the 1999 one with Keanu Reeves and Gary Oldman and Winona Ryder, they put that in as a big part of it, but that was all stolen from the Barnabas story arc. So yeah, so it really kind of begins there with that. But I think that there's always been kind of an undertone of like the idea of this I think that Lugosi really sold Dracula a lot because of his charisma and a little bit of the sexuality that he sort of brought to the role. And I think that the idea of this like very powerful being, like going after, a particular woman or whatever, they found that to be kind of a fantasy, kind of attractive. So yeah. Anything else?
What's your favorite modern horror film?
My favorite modern horror film? Well, I don't know. That is a very good question.
Just one of your tops.
A lot of the ones that they make today, a lot of the ones that I've seen in recent years really haven't been that great. They're kind of predictable. There's been a few good ones here and there. But most of them, like I've seen a few that I thought were pretty good, and then you get to the ending and you go, what was that? That was kind of bizarre. So yeah, I think a lot of them, they're trying to reinvent the wheel, and it's not really modern, but because it's probably 15, 20 years old now. But The Ring was a very interesting one when that came out. Some of those remakes of some of the Japanese films, so some of those were pretty interesting. I guess when you're talking about 130 years of history, that's modern. But,
Right, yeah.
Yes.
I was just going to ask if you've seen the parody movies like Dracula, Dead and Loving It,
Oh, yeah.
Young Frankenstein.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Are you a fan?
Oh yeah. Young Frankenstein is a great one. Big fan of the Munsters, of course. And Dracula, Dead and Loving It. There's a few others out there. Yeah. Some of the like scary movies. Some of those are good. Some of them get kind of dumb, but there are a few of them. Some of the first ones were pretty good. Yes.
So you can get behind all of these scary monsters and even like the parody movies, but you still can't get behind Twilight.
I cannot. So, yeah, I saw the first Twilight movie, and there was just a lot of awkward staring between. And I said, I don't think I can do this.
The dialogue.
What's that? Yeah.
The very last one.
I'll pass. Thank you. Yes.
Wasn't the creature from the Black Lagoon or whatever, wasn't his
Was it just what?
His name in the credits wasn't he kept anonymous?
They probably, yeah, well, I think part of that had to do with the fact that there were different actors that played him, depending on what the content was. So like Riku Browning did all of the stuff when he was underwater, because he was like a champion swimmer. So they hired him to do all the stuff underwater, but then the stuff when he was on land was a different actor. And I think there were a few different stuntmen that were doing some of the work, so they couldn't really say like, he is the actor, you know, he's portrayed by this one actor. It was sort of a combination of a few different people that were, you know, putting on the suit. Yeah. By the way, if you don't know, Julie Adams, who's in The Creature from the Black Lagoon, is actually from Little Rock originally, the primary actress in that film. She just passed away a few years ago. Yes?
So when did like zombies come around?
So when Lugosi did not make Frankenstein, he went and made a movie called White Zombie, which is where the band that Rob Zombie made the band was named after that film. Okay, but that was the traditional voodoo zombie, you know, with using the different potions and all of that stuff to make a zombie that was like a slave to the master, right? So it wasn't like that, you know, what we think of as the modern zombie. The idea of the modern zombie really doesn't come around until Night of the Living Dead in the late 60s. Yes?
Oh, I have something to add on to that. They're not called zombies in the film.
What's that?
In The Night of the Living Dead, they're not called zombies. That word kind of came later, and Romero didn't really think of them as being zombies.
Yeah.
Like he kind of reinvented them.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I never noticed that before. Interesting. Yes?
I like how you pointed out that it started with nerds.
Yes.
Everything good starts with nerds, and the doctors have adopted.
Absolutely.
And it turned into something that wasn't truly meant to be proper.
Well, I think that, you know, the people that we, like us, that we call nerds, we're the people who get passionate about things. We're the people who, when we get into something, we don't just kind of enjoy it. We want to know everything about it. You know, I think that's just part of the personality trait that comes with it. And it's interesting because I think that this generation, you know, of college students we have now, you guys are growing up in a very different time where, you know, being into superheroes and stuff like that is considered to be cool, and everybody's going to watch the Avenger movies and all of that stuff. But, you know, growing up in the 70s, the kid who carried around comic books and talked about monster movies probably got shoved in the locker and beat up a little bit. It's sad, but it's true. But I think that it is kind of a personality trait. It was not considered cool back in the day. But I think that ultimately, as you said, a lot of those of that generation went on to be, you know, very involved in things and being kind of movers and shakers that shaped a lot of what's happening in popular culture, in sci-fi, fantasy, all of that stuff. This is probably the most questions I've had. I've given this lecture, I think, 7 or 8 times. I've even been invited to do it at a couple of Comic Cons. I did it at OBU. I did it at the Jonesboro campus. So, but you guys probably have had the most questions. That's good. Yes?
So you said it started off with boys, and was it at what point were the girls that started looking at the monsters and getting more into it?
Well, I definitely think that Dark Shadows definitely had a very strong female following. I mean, they were the ones who wanted to keep Barnabas on the air. So I think that maybe might have been kind of the beginning of that. And then, of course, then you start getting things like Anne Rice writing the Vampire Chronicles, and so now you have a woman writer. Of course, you know, we had Mary Shelley, but now you have a very prominent female writer writing in the horror genre and things like that. So, and then the Stephen King thing started becoming a little bit more accessible. So probably late 60s into the 70s was probably when it started becoming a little more acceptable. And when I say that it was mostly the boys, I mean, to be clear, it's not that there weren't women who liked watching these movies or, you know, were into this sort of thing, but it was more from a casual level. You know, they weren't going, I've got to know who it is that plays bride number 3 in Dracula. You know, they weren't to that level of, you know. So it really is just kind of a different level of for lack of a better word, obsession over, you know, these films and wanting to know everything. I think that even with a lot of things today, I think that the women who are into it, not all of them alive, are more casual enjoyers rather than really wanting to get into the minutiae of everything. There are exceptions to every rule, of course. And feel free to agree to disagree with me. Yes.
Okay, so are ghosts like a more modern thing, or have they been around since like zombies and stuff?
Ghost?
Yeah.
Ghosts have been around. Ghosts have appeared in different movies, you know, over the years. There's not really. I didn't talk about them. There have been, you know, a lot of ghost movies, and Dark Shadows included several ghost characters, things like that. In fact, the first supernatural character they introduced was a ghost, which is where the ratings started to shoot up a little bit before Barnabas came on. But there's not really like an iconic image of a ghost other than the white sheet, and there's not really like a movie that features a character like that, which is why I didn't really talk about them. But sure, there are tons of movies, even going back to the silent era, that featured ghosts. What else? Yes.
One of the things I think is kind of interesting about the early Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde movie was that in the transformation scene, he actually had the makeup on the whole time.
Right.
It was just through different lightings that
Right.
they were able to make it look like he transformed.
Yeah. So what he's talking about is that if you see the Frederick March, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde film, they use this. It's kind of like a green screen kind of effect. They put this like red makeup on his face, and with black and white film, with certain lighting, the film didn't pick up the makeup, and then they changed the lighting, which reflected that makeup, and suddenly you could see it, and it made it look like there was a transformation right there on the screen without having to stop the film like they did, you know, like with the Wolfman movies. They basically tied him down to a chair, glued a little bit of hair on him, and then ran the film, and then stopped it, glued a little bit more. You know, it was a tedious thing. But they were able to do that transformation with just changing the lighting and reflection to make up those on his face. Yeah, very interesting technique. Yes?
Okay, so Dracula does the whole bat thing. When did that start happening? Because I know it wasn't in the earlier movies.
Actually, we do see in, I'll have to stop and think which one is first. In Son of Dracula, they do see him. No. In the original Dracula, you don't see him turn into a bat, but you do see the bat, and then they do talk about seeing a wolf. So that's already part of the legend. But in Son of Dracula, which is two sequels down, they actually do show, played by Lon Chaney, they do actually show Dracula actually turn into a wolf. I mean, into a bat. So yeah. So even that early. And there's also another film called Return of the Vampire that has Lugosi playing a different character that's basically, they tried to make a Dracula sequel and couldn't get the rights to it, so they changed the name. But you see him turn into a bat in that as well. Okay, unless anybody else just has one more question. You guys have already asked about. The music students are all asking questions. You guys can ask, I'll give you one more and you guys can ask questions later. Yes?
Okay, so when did the vampire werewolf feud start?
That really, I mean, in the classic films, you don't really see that. That's been a more modern thing. I think that really, it might have come about in fiction, but in movies, it's not really until you get to like the underworld movies that you start seeing that being like a big thing. And those were produced like early 2000s, something like that. All right, so we're going to end it there. But thank you guys. I appreciate you being here and your attention. If you think of any dying questions you got to know that you didn't think of today, feel free to drop me an email.